Ahoy lads, I see that you have returned once again to receive your dose of Kenshi content. And there's nothing that I do better than give Kenshi content. In fact, it's basically what my entire platform has been built on. Now, just to jump right into things, after my last video, there was a bit of a debate that got started in the community about whether or not multiplayer has a place in Kenshi 2. Which is ironic, because that video had literally nothing to do with multiplayer. It was more or less about what the Redacted feature was, but I never mentioned multiplayer in that video. But the comment section became quite a buzz with whether or not people thought multiplayer should be included in Kenshi 2. So, out of curiosity, after following some of these lines of conversation, I decided to figure out what the actual community consensus was. And so I posted a poll on my community page asking everyone to vote on whether they wanted Kenshi 2 to have multiplayer, whether they did not want it to have multiplayer, or whether they honestly just did not care. And after the first 24 hours, it was really neck and neck at almost 33% across the board. However, after that first 24-hour mark, things really started to teeter towards no, with it going up to about 50% of the community saying they did not want multiplayer in Kenshi 2. Now, I personally found this really interesting because typically in the comment sections, I see a lot of people pushing for Kenshi 2 to have multiplayer. And it could just be one of those situations where the people that don't want it or the people that don't care just are less likely to post about it. But the verbal community consensus has always been that they wanted Kenshi 2 to have multiplayer, but the results of the poll showed a different story. But despite the fact that it seems like most of the community either does not want Kenshi 2 to have multiplayer or they simply don't care, there is still a sizable chunk of the community that does seem to want it. So I wanted to take a little bit of time today to kind of go over some of the possibilities about how multiplayer might function if it was implemented in Kenshi 2, what some of the upsides may be, how gameplay may look, and what some of the drawbacks may be as well. And before I really get started, I do want to say that this is not designed to sway people to one side or the other. It is more or less just a way to look at it from an unbiased perspective and come to a conclusion about how multiplayer might function if it was in Kenshi 2 and see if it is worth it in the long run to do so. So let's go ahead and dive right on in. So when I'm looking at how Kenshi 1 works and how that might translate into Kenshi 2, one of the most glaring issues that immediately pops out is the use of time control in Kenshi 1. Now, to clarify, I'm not referring to the ability to speed up time. I actually have a solution for that. My main concern would be the ability to pause time, because I imagine most people play similarly to me and they use the speed up time feature as a way to regulate things like travel, building, research, healing, stuff like that. Things where they can turn it on and walk away for a minute or just sit there for a moment and let things happen. This same manner of use does not translate, however, to the pause function, which I use rather chaotically. In fact, during just a simple encounter, I can very easily pause and start the game a dozen times because I'm repositioning units, planning my next move out, and deciding what I should be doing. Now, the reason I think the pause function in comparison to that of, say, the speed up function would not translate well into multiplayer is that with a speed up function, you could easily set it up on something sort of like a vote system, where both parties have to hit the speed up button for it to activate. If one person hits it, it simply doesn't do anything. You have to come to an agreement to do so. And then, if either player decides to return things back to normal speed, it does not require both people. You have to have a consensus of both parties to increase the speed, and if either one back out, it goes back to the normal speed. But with a pause function, especially since it's not even just linked to the UI, it's actually linked to the spacebar, it becomes a lot more complicated. And so I think the only way that they would be able to implement time controls in Kenshi 2 would be to either remove the pause function in its entirety or remove time controls in its entirety. Those are pretty much the only options they'd have. And let's face it, if you remove time controls from Kenshi, especially considering the map is expected to be larger with new unexplored areas, it's really going to slow down pacing and progression. It's going to kind of make the game a lot more monotonous and tedious than it already is. Another topic that kind of comes up when thinking about Kenshi 2 and how it might implement a multiplayer system is how the world might respond to having multiple parties running around actively doing things outside of what the AI is programmed to do. You see, in Kenshi 1, as many of us know, there's the use of world states, where the world will dynamically change based on the actions that we take, kind of like a form of consequence or a form of cause and effect. These allow us to have some level of control over the state of the world, as well as an impact on the world itself. So now, in a system where you have multiple parties running around impacting those world states, you could have entire dynamic changes in the world that one party member is maybe unaware of as a result of other people doing things. And this is both a good and bad thing. I say that because we have mods like the Reactive World mod, where the AI continues to function even when we're not around. I've had entire playthroughs using Reactive World where I went to Mongrel to find Beep, only to realize that he had been killed days before in-game, and I had no idea, because the world still moves even though I'm not there, and it does make the world feel alive. And so implementing a feature where you could have multiple people running around with squads changing the world and impacting the world does create a unique idea where the world feels very dynamic and lived in and lively, and it kind of reinforces that idea in Kenshi that you are not the chosen one and you're not special, and the world will continue to move with or without you. But it also kind of affects player agency too, because now you could have an entire world state change and you have no idea, and it could potentially ruin certain playthroughs depending on what's going on. And I know that kind of sounds eerily similar to what I just described with Beep, but I'm talking about on a much larger scale. Imagine if you went to go to the United Cities, even with Reactive World on, only to find out that the rebels had won, and the cities were all in ruin, and the Empire had fallen. Buildings destroyed, shopkeepers gone, access to certain equipment is gone, and you had no idea. Now, this is not to say that is a smoking gun against Kenshi 2's multiplayer, but it is something we should consider because it may not be for everybody. Another concern that I have is how squad management might work in a multiplayer system. Now, we can't be too certain how the squad management system is going to function in Kenshi 2, but we can assume that it is probably going to be very close to, if not identical to that of Kenshi 1, because, to be honest, don't fix what isn't broken. The most I could probably recommend is increasing the squad limits and the number of squads that you could have. But what we do know is that in Kenshi 1 you have your faction, and then in that faction you can have a number of squads, and that each of those squads can have a finite number of units assigned to them. Now the question I have is, in a multiplayer system, would we still have a singular faction where each player controls a squad, or would we be able to have multiple factions where each player controls multiple squads, or even just relegated to one squad? And would there be a cap on the number of player characters available to each person as a result of this multiplayer system? There's a lot of things to consider. If there are multiple factions, how would the reputation system impact one faction over the other? If there were a singular faction, how would they break up the squad management system? Would you suddenly only be able to have 2 squads, one for one person, one for the other? Or could each person have multiple squads? These are all things that we really have to look at when looking at a potential multiplayer system. Because the unfortunate reality is that Kenshi's player management is not designed well for a multiplayer system, and in truth would require a pretty large and substantial overhaul in order to make it feasible where you can still have the same feel of Kenshi. Because as is, if you implemented a multiplayer system, I truly feel like you would either have to sacrifice the feel for what Kenshi is and how it plays, or simply forego having a multiplayer system in its entirety. Another thing that comes to mind on how multiplayer might function in Kenshi is how the world is actually saved. Is it saved on a server? Is it saved on one individual's PC that is hosting? Would it require both people to be playing at the same time? Or could one person play while the other person is offline? Would it be relegated to just the person who has access to the save file? Or would both people be able to hop on and play individually at different times? These are all also things that I would want to know going into a multiplayer system, because they are impactful. If one person controls the world state, suddenly everyone else is relegated to building themselves around that individual person. That's not necessarily a bad thing. Plenty of games have done it successfully in the past. But again, the way Kenshi has been designed to operate historically, I don't think would translate well, because it requires a lot of time. And upon closer inspection, I don't see a multiplayer system working out very well where one person is able to hop in anytime they want and everybody else is unfortunately relegated to being available at the same time. It creates a really large gap of progression where one person can progress infinitely faster than everybody else, and everyone else kind of has to toe the line or trail behind and ride the coattails of the main person on the save. And again, that's not necessarily a bad thing. I've seen plenty of games do it successfully in the past, but I don't know if it translates well to Kenshi. But switching over to more positive aspects of a potential multiplayer system, I love the idea for dynamic roleplay, and I love the idea of wandering through the sands of Kenshi with my buddies and hunting down bounties and building a city with them, and just seeing other characters moving and behaving in a way that is more fluid and more decisive than that of the AI than we're used to. Because in truth, even though Kenshi 2 is being made on a much more updated engine with much more potential for AI behaviors, there's still AI behaviors that are packaged and programmed. And they're always going to lack some of that human flavor that we kind of want when we're playing a game like Kenshi. Because let's be honest, when we're walking through the world of Kenshi, it can get kinda lonely sometimes, especially when you realize that everyone else is set up on these defined routes. They have these defined features about them where they're not going to ever really dynamically change outside the use of mods. And even those can only do so much. Whereas adding in other people to the equation, suddenly the world can feel a lot more lively and you can see people doing things that you would not normally see. And I think that in terms of camaraderie, in terms of playing the game, and in terms of spending time with your friends, that would be a phenomenal experience. And to be honest, I can already see sitting around with my buddies building this massive fortress and this massive outpost, setting up different units and assigning them jobs. Maybe I'll act as the blacksmith while one of them acts as the farmer. Maybe we all just act as a roaming caravan, packing up our camp supplies, roaming around, hunting down bounties, and just making a living as we go. Or maybe we all just decide to basically function as tech hunters, going around collecting things, looking for our riches in life, and we do that as a unit, as a group. I think one of the biggest things that appeals to people about Kenshi 2 and the possibility of having a multiplayer system has nothing to do with the game itself. It's about the idea of being able to introduce your friends to this world and create lasting memories with them. And to be honest, I think that's where the vast majority of the people that want Kenshi 2's multiplayer comes from. They're just people that want to play with their friends. They want to introduce them to this world. And they want to have that experience with them where they can all sit down collectively and remember that time that they went and they fought off an entire horde of cannibals together. Because as much as we love roaming around Kenshi's wastes, as much as we love building our bases and taking over factions and uprooting empires, we're doing it alone. And the idea that we could do that with our friends instead, it almost, in my opinion, makes all the flaws potentially worth it. Now, if you were to ask me what my opinion on Kenshi 2's multiplayer system would be, I would probably fall in the 27% that just don't really care either way. Because in truth, whether it has multiplayer or not, I'm still going to buy it. I'm still going to enjoy it, and I'm still going to sink so much time into creating content for you guys on it. So even though I can see the glaring flaws with how Kenshi 2's multiplayer might function, I can also see the potential for it being an absolutely revolutionary experience. And frankly, it's one that regardless of whether or not it's implemented, we will all collectively share on the community. Even if we don't get to step foot into each other's world, we're still going to be sharing our experiences. We're still going to be enjoying the game, and we're still going to be talking about it as a community. But all of that stuff is really just my opinion, and I would love to hear your guys' opinion down below on whether or not you think Kenshi 2 should have a multiplayer system, or if it should remain the solo game that we're used to and just simply focus on improvement of existing features. I've been here when it's said. I appreciate all your time. Use your powers for good instead of evil. Make a difference in someone's life, and don't let your wife open the door on prayer day. Never a good idea.